Hi. We are now talking to Tim Newburn, Professor of Criminology and Social Policy and Director of the Mannheim Center for Criminology at the London School of Economics. I'm extremely happy that you're here because I think there is a number of... We have been talking about in very kind of idealistic terms about London, but I think there's also a kind of very dark side to London. And for me, one of the darkest sides of London is its complete surrender and our complicitness in that surrender to the whole notion of policing. I think it is perhaps of all the cities in the world, the one not only where there is the density of CCTV cameras highest, but where also, if you read the ground as a script, it is full of traps and points where you can betray yourself. One that kind of really imposes an incredible amount of behavior on the citizens. And I'm kind of wondering whether you can explain this enthusiasm for policing that we feel, and why it doesn't affect our sense of the city.
Okay, I'm intrigued by the question. When you started, and you were talking about what I thought was the kind of underbelly of the city. I thought it was going to be a question about crime,
No.
predicted, but actually it's a question about social control and policing. And it's an intriguing issue, I think, why it is not just as it's possibly particularly visible in London, but something which is kind of characteristic of Britain generally, and something which separates us, I think, from most other nations, which is, how is it that we find ourselves, as you put it, where we're watched constantly, where there are cameras almost everywhere, including here, where you wake up in the morning and once you leave your home and walk down the street, go to work or wherever it is, you go from railway station to bus, along the street, through the city, possibly to your place of work, and all the way, at least there's the potential that you're watched.
But in addition, you buy newspapers that are crying out for more police, more security, and that in which crime plays a kind of huge and disproportionate role.
Well, we're part, I think, though we may be at the more kind of egregious end of it, of a worldwide movement, really, certainly in liberal democracies, which is a kind of, in which people are increasingly buying into the idea that we are surrounded by crime, that things are always getting worse, and that the only solution to it is more control. Now, I don't know whether it's a reasonable thing to do, but perhaps we can just involve the audience for a second. Can I ask people to put their hands in the air, or what I'd like to do is just ask people whether they think crime is going up or crime is going down. Perhaps if you think crime is going up over the period, let's say, of the last 10 years in England generally or in London, if you think it's going up, please put your hands in the air. We've got a frighteningly intelligent audience, obviously. I do it with students all the time, and it's the general perception popularly is that crime is going up, that somehow year on year, month on month, crime rises. The reality is crime's been going down now pretty steadily on most categories for a decade or more, and yet we buy in most of the time, as you're implying, Rem, to the notion that what we need is more control, more prisons, more police, and so forth. And it's a largely politically driven conceit. And the reason for it, if you were looking for a single reason for it, is that around about, in a period somewhere 10 to 15 years ago, politicians on the left persuaded themselves that if they presented themselves publicly any way other than tough on crime, that was electoral suicide. So we suddenly found ourselves, as the same would be true in the United States, the same is largely true in many it's true in Australia and in many continental European countries, that parties of the right and now parties on the left find themselves kind of conjoined in a really nasty marriage of penal populism, of tough on crime.
And that's something you've actually explored a lot in a book you've edited with Trevor Johns called Plural Policing. So I was somehow wondering if you could tell us a little bit the key ideas of that notion of plural policing.
Well, the idea, I mean, it's kind of related in a sense to what we're talking about, which is that for a short period, maybe 40 or 50 years ago in England, and for a while, I kind of look around to see what age people are here, there was a kind of notion that there was a thin blue line, was the metaphor, between us and disorderliness, and that thin blue line was the police. It was the employees of the state who wore blue uniforms and funny pointed helmets, who walked the streets in those days, who were epitomized initially in an Ealing film of the 1950s, and then subsequently in a television series called Dixon and Doc Green. And that was the high point, if you like, of the kind of legitimacy of policing in the UK. Now, at the heart of that notion, amongst other things, was the idea that actually policing was done by the police. And this goes back to your first question. Actually, in practice, policing has always been done by a whole array of organizations. The idea, I guess, that in the book, and what underpins the book, is the sense that it's now impossible to deny that all around us there are policing organizations of various hues wearing outfits and uniforms of various different colors, or maybe not uniforms at all, or appearing in other guises like closed-circuit television and so forth. So the kind of, if you like, the questions in the book are, how do these organizations work? How do they relate to each other? How many people are employed doing things like private security and so forth? And more importantly, to what extent does this vary? If you look across the developed world, to what extent are these arrangements the same in every place or different?
And what do you find?
What you find is that there are some differences culturally. So to go back to our starting point, it's Britain that's most besotted with closed-circuit television. You won't find that in the United States or indeed in Canada or in continental Europe to the extent that we find it here, though we're beginning to kind of move in that direction in some other countries. But in terms of the general trend, in the terms of using things like prison much more extensively than we have in the past, to employ more and more police officers, more and more private security guards, to go down the road the whole time of formalizing social control, is essentially the pattern that you will find in most liberal democracies now.
How do you see the future development of these tendencies? We had earlier tonight Charles Jenks here, who, among many other things, is a futurist, and said, Bram said with a sort of prediction of 80% predicts the future. It would be interesting to hear from you how you see the future development of this sort of plural policing thing.
Well, I'm an optimist, which means that generally I'm wrong. So that I'm not all that regularly, but from time to time write kind of futurology pieces about what policing is going to look like in 10 years, or what the prison system is going to look like in 10 years, and it's almost always wrong because it's almost always worse. So kind of casting aside the optimistic bit, I'm desperately pessimistic about everything that's happening in the kind of crime, justice, social order way of things. We now have, in Britain, 78,000 people in prison, where 10 years ago we had 45,000 people in prison. In the United States, why not use the most egregious example of this? Forgive me those who already know these figures. There are currently somewhere in the region of 2.2 million people in prison in the United States. If you add on to that the numbers of people on parole and probation and electronic tagging and so forth, there are somewhere in the region of 7 million people in the United States. This is a country of 250, 260 million, kind of under the control of the criminal justice system, and it continues to expand, whilst, let me say, crime is going down. Now, am I optimistic? No, I'm desperately pessimistic, because if I think we go back, no matter where you look in our political system, Republicans and Democrats, Conservatives or Labour Party, we're locked into the notion that what we need is more. It doesn't matter what's happening, it doesn't matter whether the trends are good or more or less good. What they say to us continuously is, let us spend more of your taxpayers' money on prisons. We've had that announcement this week. Let's spend more of your taxpayers' money on closed-circuit television, on policing and so forth. Where I see it going is more formalization of social control, so that increasingly every aspect of our lives becomes governed by increasingly subtle rules about how we can behave, where we can go, what we must do, whether we can step on the grass, how much we can drink, whether we can smoke, and so forth. And those rules become, in a sense, they appear less and less like policing, and yet they actually are more and more insidious as a form of social control.
So can you combine your observations with the kind of highly idealistic tones that you've heard before in this meeting?
Well, it's difficult.
In other words, are we kind of being incredibly naive with this living under this regime, and still maintaining all our fictions of kind of freedom?
Well, I mean, I think that kind of coming back to the optimistic bit of me, and trying to feed into the kind of feel-good arguments is that, I mean, I think the history of kind of crime and justice tells you that there comes a time when people say no more. That actually, you know, in the 1850s, 1860s, when we'd been transporting tens of thousands of people originally to America and then to Australia, there came a time when actually enough was enough. There came a time when we no longer hanged people in public, and so forth. So my sense is that there will come a moment actually where voters, citizens will say to politicians, we don't buy this as a story anymore, that this narrative you've been feeding us of more and more control just doesn't sit comfortably with the way in which we want to live our lives. Now, the difficulty becomes, where's the tipping point in this? What is going to bring the moment that actually kind of people in sufficient numbers say, no, we vote for you on different terms?
Yeah, when we read your text this afternoon, I mean, we've sort of discussed also this issue that, I mean, how strange it is that there is kind of no protest at eliminating freedom. So it's something I wanted to ask you, because it seems sometimes very surprising that there is no protest.
Well, I think that there's a kind of other that's used the whole time to, in a sense, I mean, make this sound too apocalyptic, but in a sense to kind of scare us away from that sense of resistance. And traditionally that other has been, you know, the kind of street mugger, or, you know, the person that's going to attack you on the street late at night and so forth. Now the other has become the kind of international terrorist. So the moment when we feel
it's a never-ending,
it's a kind of, there's a never-ending, a kind of accretion of threat. Now, obviously, many of these threats are real, and yet as Londoners, and I think, you know, in a sense, bringing it back A to London and B to optimism, that's the moment where you actually begin to, I think, put some of those things together, that actually Londoners every day, post the 7th of July last year, 21st of July last year, have gone about their everyday lives, actually haven't clamoured for new anti-terrorist legislation, haven't been asking the mayor week after week for more police officers, more closed-circuit television. Actually, the bulk of Londoners have gone about their lives in very ordinary ways. And I think that's, in a sense, something very important to hang on to in thinking about the future of policing and the future of justice.
And as this leads to a more optimistic note, I wanted to ask you if you had kind of any dreams or unrealized projects.
Well, probably unrealized projects. Dreams, if I stick with London, the dreams would be, and I'll stick with kind of my area, which is, I'm a criminologist, so for good or ill and sad life that maybe I spend my life thinking and writing about crime and criminality and so on. If people ask difficult questions like, you know, so what do you do about this, and what are the causes, and why is there this amount of crime and not less? The things that you would really want to change, and therefore the dreams about London, would be twofold, I thought, or maybe threefold. First of all, I think democracy. Actually what you need more of in any capital city or actually in any jurisdiction is more democracy. You need to link people to the democratic process. And it's linking people to the democratic process and linking them to the democratic process and policing that I think educates people and actually brings about more coherent, more just, more enlightened criminal justice policies. Secondly, I'd say that there's something, and this will sound kind of desperately bleeding heart, but there's something very important about social inequality. What we know, I think, about trends in crime is that when things go badly wrong, they go badly wrong because the gap between the richest and the poorest gets unfeasibly big. And so in terms of the capital city, The real worry and the thing that one needs to guard against is that unrealistically big gap between the wealthiest and the poorest, particularly in juxtaposition, and doing something about that's crucial. And finally, if I may, I think it's the political thing. The dream, and it feels like the thing that's most dreamlike almost, is getting our politicians, and I, to a degree, absolve our mayor from this one, because I think he's one of our more realistic politicians in this regard, to get our politicians to talk realistically about crime.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.